People ask me when I knew. They want a clean answer, a news broadcast, a government alert, a moment where the truth landed and I acted on it. It wasn't like that. What I had was a feeling backed by arithmetic, and the arithmetic came from pigs. My name is Harlan Selvedge. I'm 53 years old. I've run a 280-acre operation outside of Grinnell, Iowa, since I was 26, when my father's kidneys failed and the farm passed to me like a stone passes to water. Not gently, and not because anyone chose it. Corn and soybeans in rotation across the field acreage. A 12-sow farrowing operation that I'd scaled down from my father's 30. A pole barn full of equipment I mostly maintained myself, and a house built in 1974 that my mother called sturdy and my ex-wife called unlivable. I never argued with either of them. I tell you this so you understand. I am not a survivalist. I don't own body armor. I never built a bunker. What I am is a man who has spent 27 years managing systems that fail. Combines that throw bearings at harvest, sows that breach farrowing crates, wells that drop pressure in August. My entire adult life has been the practice of imagining what goes wrong next and having the parts on hand to address it. That's not paranoia. That's row crop farming in the Midwest. The pigs told me something was coming. Not literally, I'm not that far gone. But in late September, maybe 10 days before the outbreak crossed the Mississippi, my sows started refusing feed. All 12 pens, same morning. I'd seen refusal before. Heat stress, mold in the corn, sometimes a bad batch of supplement. But this was behavioral. They were alert, agitated, pressing against the far walls of their crates like something in the air had changed. I checked ventilation, tested the feed, ran water samples. Everything clean. They stayed off feed for 3 days, then resumed eating, but never settled. Pacing, vocalizing at odd hours. I've farrowed over 1,000 litters in my life. I know what stress looks like in a hog, and this wasn't any stress I'd cataloged. The same week, I noticed the starlings. Normally, by late September, the murmurations are building. Thousands of birds wheeling over the fields at dusk. That year, they were gone. Not reduced. Gone. I drove the perimeter roads for 2 evenings and saw nothing. The tree lines were silent. I mentioned it to Orrin's stag, who farms the section north of mine, and he shrugged and said maybe they'd moved early. Orrin doesn't notice things that don't affect his yield. I started watching the news more carefully. There were reports out of the East Coast, first New Jersey, then the Philadelphia suburbs, about a hemorrhagic illness with unusual neurological symptoms. The CDC was calling it a novel pathogen. The footage was clinical, distant, bureaucratic. But I noticed 2 things that the anchors didn't emphasize. First, the affected areas were implementing involuntary quarantines, which meant the voluntary ones had already failed. Second, the case fatality rate was being reported at 11%, but the recovery rate wasn't being reported at all. That gap between dying and recovering is where the truth was hiding. If 89% of patients were recovering, someone would have said so. No one was saying so. I sat at my kitchen table on a Tuesday night and did what I always do when a system starts showing anomalies. I mapped dependencies. My farm depends on electricity, diesel, propane, municipal water as backup to my well, feed deliveries every 2 weeks, veterinary access, and a road network that connects me to all of it. If even 2 of those inputs failed simultaneously, I'd be in cascade within a week. If the thing on the news was as bad as the silence around it suggested, I could lose all of them. So I started. Not panicking, not hoarding. Working. Wednesday morning, I drove to the Tractor Supply in Newton and bought the last 12 rolls of hardware cloth they had in stock, plus 40 pounds of fence staples, a case of zip ties, and every box of 3-inch deck screws on the shelf. The clerk, a kid named Paulson, asked if I was building a dog run. I told him I was reinforcing my farrowing barn, which was true in the sense that I intended to do that also. From there, I went to the fairway and filled 2 carts: canned goods, dry rice, dry beans, powdered milk, bleach, hydrogen peroxide, ibuprofen, vitamins, and salt. I paid in cash. Nobody looked at me strangely. People in Iowa buy in bulk. That's just Tuesday. Wednesday afternoon and all of Thursday, I worked the house. I'll describe what I did because it mattered later, and because most people misunderstand what fortifying a farmhouse means. You're not building a fortress. You're managing entry points. My house has 11 windows on the ground floor, 2 exterior doors, and a basement with 2 egress windows and a bulkhead entrance. The second floor has 6 windows and a pull-down attic access. The walls are standard wood frame construction with vinyl siding. They'll stop wind and rain, but not a determined human, let alone a crowd. So the windows were the priority. I cut sheets of 3/4-inch plywood to fit each ground floor window from the inside, pre-drilled them, and mounted them on French cleats so they could be lifted into place and secured in under a minute, but removed if I needed ventilation or sightlines. The hardware cloth went over the plywood on the exterior side, not to stop a breach, but to slow one. If something got through the glass, it would hit cloth and plywood before reaching interior space, and the noise would give me time. Both exterior doors got crossbar reinforcement. 2x6s dropped into steel brackets I lag-bolted into the framing. The basement bulkhead I sealed entirely with construction adhesive and 6-inch timber screws. If I needed to get out, I'd go through a window upstairs. One-way exits are fine. It's the 2-way ones that kill you. I filled every container I owned with water: the bathtub, the kitchen pots, 5-gallon buckets from the barn, a 275-gallon IBC tote I'd used for herbicide mixing that I triple-rinsed and filled from the garden hose. My well runs on a 240-volt submersible pump, so it needs electricity. I have a propane standby generator rated for the house panel with a 500-gallon tank that was sitting at about 60%. That's roughly 300 gallons, which, at conservative run cycles, 4 hours on, 4 hours off, would give me weeks of intermittent power. I also disconnected the well pump from the house panel and wired it to a dedicated 30-amp circuit so I could run just the pump without powering everything else. Water without lights uses 1/4 of the fuel. Thursday evening, I dealt with the pigs. This is the part I don't talk about easily, even now. I had 12 sows. Several were bred. I couldn't feed them indefinitely if deliveries stopped, and I couldn't let them starve. I opened every gate, walked them out through the south lot, and let them go. All 12. They milled around the barnyard for an hour, confused, then drifted toward the creek bottom in a loose group. I watched them go from the barn door and felt something I can only describe as the severance of a routine so old it had become identity. I'd had pigs on that property every day of my life. The barn was empty for the first time since 1971. I ate dinner alone that night. Canned chili, crackers, the last of a bag of apples, and watched the news until the signal dropped at 11:40 p.m. The last thing I saw was a reporter in Trenton, New Jersey, standing in front of a hospital parking lot that appeared to be on fire. He was mid-sentence when the feed cut. It didn't come back. Friday morning, the internet was down. My cell phone had intermittent signal, enough to load text, but not pages. I got a single text from my daughter, Lenore, in Minneapolis. "Dad, are you watching this? Stay inside. I love you. I replied, already ahead of you. Stay put. I'll come when I can. The message showed as delivered. I don't know if she ever read it. By Friday afternoon, the power grid was flickering. I switched to the generator and began my rationing protocol. 4 hours on, starting at 6 a.m., for water pumping, refrigerator cycling, and radio charging. Then off until 6 p.m. for another 2-hour window. I had a hand-crank emergency radio that picked up WHO out of Des Moines, and the broadcasts confirmed what the animals and the silence had already told me. It was here. Not in Grinnell yet, but in Des Moines. In Iowa City. In Cedar Rapids. The broadcast used the word quarantine for the first 2 days, then switched to containment, then stopped using institutional language altogether. By Saturday night, the WHO signal was a loop. Remain in your homes. Do not travel. Assistance is being coordinated. It played every 4 minutes. No human voice interrupted it. I want to be clear about what the first week was like, because people imagine constant siege, and that's not accurate. The first week was silence. Enormous, disorienting silence. No traffic on the county road. No planes. No distant combines. It was harvest season, and nobody was harvesting. I could hear the wind move through the standing corn across the road, a sound I'd heard every autumn of my life, but never without the underlying hum of civilization providing context. Without that hum, the wind in the corn sounded like breathing. I saw my first infected person on the 4th day, a Sunday. I was on the 2nd floor, scanning the road with my father's Bushnell binoculars, and I spotted a figure moving along the shoulder about a 1/4 mile east. It was walking, but wrong. The gait was arrhythmic, lurching, like someone navigating a steep slope on flat ground. It wore what looked like hospital scrubs, pale blue, stained dark from the waist down. It didn't turn toward my property. It passed like weather, slow and impersonal, and it was the most frightening thing I'd ever seen. Not because of what it was, but because of how ordinary the road looked behind it. The same asphalt, the same ditch, the same fence posts. The world hadn't changed shape. It had just changed rules. Over the next 3 days, I saw 6 more. Always on the road, always moving west, always alone. They didn't cluster. They didn't run. They moved with a kind of degraded persistence that reminded me of livestock in a loading chute. Forward, because forward was the only direction left. None of them approached the house. My driveway is a 1/4 mile long, gravel, bordered by ditches on both sides, and there was nothing drawing them in. No lights visible at night, no sounds, no movement. I was a dark shape in a dark landscape, and they were following the road because the road was the path of least resistance. I learned later that this is typical early-stage behavior. They orient to roads, paths, and open corridors. It's only when they detect stimuli that they deviate. In those first days, I provided no stimuli. On the 8th day, Orrin Stagg's truck came down my driveway. I heard it before I saw it, the unmistakable diesel rattle of his old Ford F-350 moving fast on gravel. I was in the kitchen. I grabbed my rifle, a Remington 700 in .308 that I use for deer, and went to the front window, lifting the plywood panel just enough to see. Orrin's truck skidded to a stop in the yard. He got out alone, walked to my front door, and pounded on it. "Harlan, I know you're in there. I can see the propane line running." I opened the door. Orrin looked like he'd aged 5 years in a week. He's 61, a big man, usually ruddy and sure of himself. Now he was pale and thin-lipped, with mud on his boots and a hunting vest over a pajama top. "My well pump burned out," he said. "I've been drinking pond water for 2 days." I've got Della with me. She's in the truck. Della is his wife. She's 58, diabetic, and has a hip replacement that limits her mobility. Orrin was asking to come in, but he wasn't asking. He was standing on my porch with his sick wife in the truck, and the math of refusing a neighbor of 20-plus years was not math I was willing to do. I helped Della inside. She was dehydrated but coherent. I gave her water, then electrolyte solution I mixed from salt, sugar, and the powdered drink mix I'd bought. Orrin brought in a duffel bag and a shotgun. We put Della on the couch in the living room, and Orrin sat in the kitchen with me. And for the first time since the outbreak, I had another voice in the house. Orrin told me what had happened on his end. No preparation, no early action, just a gradual realization over 3 days that nobody was coming to fix anything. His generator had run out of propane by day 5. His well pump had seized without power cycling, and when the power briefly surged back on day 6, the motor burned. He'd been carrying water from his stock pond in buckets, boiling it on a camp stove. Della's blood sugar had spiked, then crashed. He'd tried to drive to the hospital in Grinnell, found the roads blocked by abandoned vehicles on the highway, turned around, and come to me. I didn't resent Orrin for not preparing. Orrin's not stupid. He's just confident in systems. He believed the power would come back, the water would run, the government would arrive. He'd been right about those things every other time. The difference between Orrin and me isn't intelligence. It's that I spent my whole life watching things break, and Orrin spent his watching things hold. We settled into a routine. Orrin and I divided the daily work: water retrieval, generator cycling, perimeter checks, radio monitoring. Della managed the kitchen, rationing meals, keeping inventory on a yellow legal pad she'd brought from home. I showed Orrin the window reinforcements, and he improved them, adding a second layer of plywood on the 2 largest ground floor windows. He's a better carpenter than I am. He doesn't measure twice, he measures once and cuts correctly the first time. The radio loop from WHO Des Moines stopped on day 10. Just dead air. We scanned other frequencies and found a faint AM signal out of Omaha that was still broadcasting, a mix of emergency information and personal messages. From that signal, we learned the scope. The eastern seaboard was functionally gone. The military had established a line along the Mississippi, but it had been breached in multiple locations. Iowa was described as partially compromised. The broadcaster, a man who identified himself only as Dale in Omaha, said the governor had authorized shoot-on-sight protocols for infected individuals, and that civilian evacuation points were being established at National Guard armories, but he couldn't confirm which ones were operational. He sounded tired. Not panicked, not official, just tired. I believed everything he said because of how little he claimed to know. On day 12, the second arrivals came. Not by truck, on foot. I was on the second floor doing my morning scan when I spotted 3 figures on the road, moving west. My stomach tightened. The direction was right for infected, and so was the number, as I'd started seeing them in loose pairs by then. But through the binoculars, I saw differences. They were walking with purpose, with rhythm, with the kind of coordination that requires a functioning brain. 2 adults and what looked like a teenager. They had packs. The lead figure was a woman carrying a rifle slung across her back. They turned up my driveway. They'd seen the house. They'd seen the propane tank, the intact roof, the mowed-down grass that suggested habitation. Orrin wanted to wait them out, let them approach, assess, decide later. But the teenager was limping, badly, and the woman in front was scanning the fields with the kind of vigilance that told me she'd already been in contact with infected and survived it. These were people in transit who needed to stop, and I could either meet them at the door or let them stand in my yard where anything on the road could see them. I went out with the Remington slung and my hands visible. The woman stopped 20 yards from the porch. She was maybe 40, lean, sun-darkened, wearing cargo pants and a fleece pullover that was stiff with dried mud. Her hair was cut short and practical. She said her name was Bryn Tessero, that the teenager was her nephew, Calder, and that the man behind them was someone they'd picked up on the road 2 days prior. That man was Galt Fording. Let me describe Galt Fording, because understanding him early matters. He was perhaps 45, medium height, with the kind of build that suggests gym maintenance rather than labor. Soft through the shoulders, firm through the chest. He had clean hands. That was the first thing I noticed. 12 days into the collapse of civil society, this man had clean fingernails. He wore a canvas jacket that looked new, carried a backpack that was packed tight and organized, and had a holstered pistol on his right hip that he made no effort to conceal or brandish. He hung back while Bryn spoke, not deferring but positioning, placing himself where he could observe both the conversation and the perimeter simultaneously. When I looked at him directly, he smiled, not warmly, efficiently. A smile that said, "I am not a threat," with the precision of someone who had practiced the message. "I'm a logistics coordinator," he said when I asked what he did. "Supply chain management. I was driving from Chicago to a client site in Des Moines when everything went sideways." Bryn told me Calder had twisted his ankle badly coming down an embankment 2 days prior and needed rest. She asked for water and a night's shelter. She didn't ask to stay. I appreciated that. The request was bounded, honest, and left room for me to extend the offer on my own terms. I let them in. Della took charge of Calder's ankle. She'd been a home health aide before retirement and knew her way around a compression wrap. Bryn was quiet, observant, and immediately useful. Within an hour of entering the house, she'd identified the weak point in my south-facing window reinforcement. The plywood was braced against the frame, but not the sill, meaning enough force from below could lever it inward, and suggested a fix using angled brackets from the barn. She didn't ask permission. She identified the problem, proposed the solution, and looked at me for a yes or no. I said yes. Galt settled into the house differently. He didn't identify problems. He identified resources. Within his first evening, he had walked every room, examined the pantry, noted the generator fuel gauge, counted the water containers, and asked how deep my well was. He framed every question as helpfulness. I just want to understand the setup so I can contribute. But the cumulative effect was an inventory, and I was not the one conducting it. I noticed because I'd been doing the same thing my entire life, tracking inputs, calculating burn rates, projecting failure points. Galt was doing it too, but his math had a different variable. I was calculating how long we could sustain. Galt was calculating how long he could sustain. That night, after Della and Calder were asleep and Bryn was on watch at the upstairs window, Galt sat with me and Orrin in the kitchen. He talked. Galt was a talker, but not the rambling kind, the strategic kind. He told us about Chicago, about the first infections spreading through the hospital system, about the traffic gridlock on I-80, about a FEMA staging area outside of Joliet that had been overrun while people stood in line for bottled water. His stories were vivid, detailed, and positioned him always as the competent observer. Never panicking, always one step ahead, reading the situation before others could. After 30 minutes, I realized that every story he'd told us served the same function, establishing that he was the smartest person who had been in any room he'd occupied. Orrin, who is not a subtle man, said, "So you drove from Chicago to Des Moines. Where's your car?" The pause was brief, but I caught it. "Ran out of fuel outside Iowa City," Galt said. I walked from there, met Bryn and the kid on Route 6. It was plausible. I let it go. But I noticed Bryn, passing through to refill her water bottle, didn't nod or confirm. She just kept walking. The next morning I established ground rules. Everyone eats the same ration. Everyone takes a watch shift. Nobody goes outside alone. Nobody opens a secured entry point without announcing it. Firearms stay with their owners but are not carried loaded inside the house. Galt listened to every rule, nodded at each one, and said, "Absolutely fair." 3 days later, I found him in the barn. I'd gone out at first light to check the propane line. I'd heard a faint hissing the night before that turned out to be a loose valve fitting. And on my way back, I noticed the barn's side door was ajar. I'd closed it. I always close it. Inside, Galt was standing next to my tool bench with his backpack open on the floor. He was transferring canned goods from a cardboard box, part of my original supply cache that I'd stored in the barn's tack room, into his pack. He looked up when I entered and didn't flinch. That told me more than anything else. A person caught stealing flinches. A person executing a plan adjusts. "I was rotating stock," he said. "Some of these cans are close to the bulge point. I figured I'd move them to the house where we can use them first." The cans were fine. I'd checked them myself a week ago. But here was the calculation I had to do in real time. Confront him and create a fracture in a group of 6 people inside a building surrounded by dead things, or note it, adjust, and watch. I chose the second option. Not because I'm passive, because a confrontation with Galt, I could already tell, would not resolve into an admission. It would resolve into a performance, him reframing, redirecting, and leaving the room with everyone unsure of what had actually happened. I'd seen men like Galt before. Not many, but enough. The kind of man who, when caught in a lie, doesn't retreat. He expands the lie until it's big enough to include the truth as a subset. I moved the remaining barn supplies into the house basement that afternoon. Told Orrin I was consolidating for efficiency, and didn't mention Galt. But I started counting cans. The days developed a rhythm that was almost domestic. Mornings, water pumping, breakfast, perimeter scan. Midday, maintenance, repair, radio monitoring. Afternoons, rest and watch rotation. Evenings, dinner, conversation, early sleep. Bryn and I fell into an efficient partnership. She had a background in land management, had worked for a conservation district in Illinois, and understood soil, drainage, and fencing in ways that complemented my mechanical knowledge. She was not warm exactly. She was precise. She said what she meant, did not speculate beyond her information, and treated Calder with a fierce, contained protectiveness that suggested the boy's parents were not topics for discussion. Calder himself was 17, quiet, watchful. His ankle healed over a week. He didn't complain. He read paperback westerns from my shelf and helped Della in the kitchen without being asked. I liked him because he reminded me of myself at that age. Not brave, not especially capable, but attentive. He noticed things. He noticed, for example, that Galt's backpack was always packed. Even when we were all settled, even when the routine was stable, Galt's bag was zipped, strapped, and sitting next to his sleeping spot with his boots beside it. Ready to go. Calder mentioned this to me one afternoon while we were patching a section of porch railing. "He's not staying," Calder said. It wasn't a question. Maybe he just likes being ready. My mom kept a bag packed by the door for 3 years before she left. Same thing. I didn't respond to that, but I started watching Galt's pack the way I watched the propane gauge, as an indicator of something I couldn't directly measure. Galt's contribution to the group was, on the surface, substantial. He organized the supply inventory into a spreadsheet format using a legal pad. He calculated caloric ratios, projected consumption timelines, and presented them at dinner with the confidence of a quarterly earnings report. The numbers were good. They were also, I realized when I checked them later, slightly wrong. Not dramatically, off by 5% here, 8% there, but always in the same direction, understating what we had. If you believed Galt's numbers, we were more desperate than we were, running out sooner, needing to make harder choices faster. Why would someone understate supplies? I thought about it while repairing the garden gate on day 18. 2 reasons. First, to justify taking a larger share. If resources are scarce, the person tracking them has leverage. Second, to create urgency that positions the tracker as essential, the expert, the planner, the one whose calculations you can't afford to lose. Or a third reason, simpler and worse, to build a case for leaving. If the numbers say this place can't hold, then the rational move is to go. And if you're going, you take what you can carry. And if you've already been packing cans into your bag, then the decision has been made. You're just building the justification. I told Orrin. Just Orrin. In the barn, with the door closed, while Galt was inside on radio duty. Orrin listened, jaw working the way it does when he's processing something he doesn't want to believe. You're sure about the numbers? I counted the cans myself. We have more than he's reporting, about 12% more. That's not nothing. No. So what do? We don't confront him. We work around him. I'll keep a parallel count. If cans go missing, I'll know. Orrin didn't like it. Orrin's approach to problems is direct, a straight line from identification to confrontation. But he trusted me. And more importantly, he understood that the group's stability mattered more than catching a thief. We had 6 people in an 1,100-square-foot house with 72 cans of food, 40 pounds of dry goods, a working well, and a propane supply that would last another 3 weeks at current burn rates. That's a functional equation. A fight inside that equation could tip it faster than any external threat. So I watched. And Galt, as if sensing the observation, adjusted. He became more generous. He volunteered for the worst watch shifts, the 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. window that nobody wanted. He offered to reduce his own food ration so Calder could have more. He told Della she was doing important work. He complimented Orrin's carpentry. He asked Bryn intelligent questions about erosion control. He was, for a stretch of about 5 days, the most pleasant person in the house. And I distrusted every minute of it, because I've seen the same behavior in livestock auctions. The seller who becomes friendliest right before the hammer falls is the one who knows the animal is lame. On day 23, the first real test came. Not from Galt, from outside. I was on the upstairs watch at dusk when I saw movement in the cornfield across the road. Not a single figure, a group. Through the binoculars, I counted 9, infected, moving in a loose cluster, not coordinated but proximally grouped, drifting through the standing corn like a slow current through reeds. They were heading roughly northwest, which would take them past my property if they held course. But one of them, a large man in a dark jacket, had stopped. He was standing at the edge of the road, facing my driveway. He wasn't looking at anything. Infected don't look in the conventional sense. But he was oriented toward the house, and he wasn't moving. The others drifted past him. He stayed. I whispered downstairs. Within 2 minutes, everyone was in position. Windows secured, lights off, voices gone. We waited. Through the slit in my second-floor window panel, I watched the figure in the dark jacket stand at the end of my driveway for 47 minutes. I know because I watched the clock. 47 minutes of a dead man deciding whether to walk toward us. Then, for no reason I could identify, he turned and continued northwest. The group was already gone. He followed, alone, and disappeared into the failing light. Nobody slept well that night. The house was full of the particular tension that comes from having been seen by something you can't negotiate with. Over breakfast, Galt raised the topic of relocation. "We should think about moving," he said. "If they're clustering now, it's a matter of time before a group comes up the driveway." "They've been on the road for 3 weeks," I said. "That's the first cluster, and they didn't approach." "First one we've seen. Doesn't mean first one that's come through." He had a point, technically. But the argument wasn't really about infected movement patterns. It was about control. In this house, on my property, with my supplies and my generator and my well, I set the terms. On the road, in transit, the person with the best plan leads. And Galt always had a plan. Bryn shut it down. Moving 6 people across open terrain with 1 rifle, 1 shotgun, and a pistol is not a plan. It's a death march. Galt turned to her with that efficient smile. "I'm not saying we leave today. I'm saying we should have the conversation." "We just had it," Bryn said. I noticed Calder watching Galt during this exchange with an expression I couldn't read. Not fear, not hostility. Something more like confirmation, as if a hypothesis he'd been testing had just yielded its expected result. 2 days later, Galt came to me with a different proposal. He wanted to scout the neighboring farms, Orrin's place a mile north, the Tremmel property a mile south, and the Voss acreage 2 miles west. His argument was logistical. Those properties might have fuel, food, medical supplies, tools, abandoned houses or resources. I couldn't disagree with the logic, but I didn't trust the motivation. Scouting meant being outside the group's sight. It meant accessing supplies that nobody else could verify. And it meant Galt, alone, with his perpetually packed bag, walking away from the house with a legitimate reason. I said yes, but with a condition. He wouldn't go alone. Bryn would go with him. I expected resistance. Instead, Galt agreed immediately. "Absolutely. Buddy system. Smart." They left the next morning at first light. Bryn carried her rifle. Galt carried his pistol and his backpack. They went north first, to Orrin's place. They were gone 4 hours. When they returned, Bryn was carrying a 5-gallon fuel can and a box of 12-gauge shells. Galt was carrying a case of canned vegetables and a battery-powered lantern. Bryn gave me her report in the barn, away from the others. Orrin's place was trashed. Not by infected, but by looters. Someone had been through after Orrin left. The fuel had been in a hidden compartment in his shop that the looters had missed. The shells were under a workbench. "What about Galt?" I asked. "He knew the layout." "What do you mean?" "Orrin's house. Galt walked through it like he'd been there before. He went straight to the kitchen pantry, straight to the utility room. He didn't search. He retrieved." "That's not possible. He's from Chicago." "I know." "Did you ask him?" "No. I wanted to tell you first." I sat with that information for a long time. Galt Fording, who said he'd driven from Chicago and run out of fuel near Iowa City, had navigated Orrin Stagg's house with the familiarity of someone who'd already been inside it. There were 2 explanations. 1, he'd been through the area before, earlier in the outbreak, and had scouted properties then, which meant he'd been to my neighbors' houses before arriving at mine, which meant his story about meeting Bryn on Route 6 was constructed. 2, someone had described the layout to him, which meant he had a contact I didn't know about. Either explanation meant Galt was not what he presented. I didn't confront him. Not yet. But that night I did something I should have done on day one. I searched his backpack. He was on the 2 a.m. watch. I waited until I heard him settle into position at the upstairs window, then went to the corner of the living room where he slept. His pack was there, as always, zipped and strapped. I opened it in the dark, by touch, the way I've opened feed bags in an unlit barn 1,000 times. Inside, organized with the precision of a man who packs for departure, 8 cans of food, 4 from my supply, identifiable by the price stickers from Fairway. A first aid kit, better stocked than mine. 2 full magazines for his pistol, which he said held one. A folding knife, a bundle of zip ties, a hand-drawn map. The map stopped me. It was on notebook paper, creased and soft from handling. I took it to the basement, turned on a flashlight under a blanket, and studied it. It showed this area, recognizably, with road numbers and landmarks. My property was marked. Orrin's was marked. The Tremel place was marked. And to the west, about 9 miles away, a location labeled CP was circled twice. Below the circle, in small, neat handwriting, resupply, day 30 to 35. CP, collection point, resupply. Galt wasn't stranded. Galt was operating. He had a destination, a timeline, and a network. He'd embedded himself in my house not because he needed shelter, but because my property was a waypoint, a resource cache on the route to wherever he was actually going. The cans in his bag were provisions for the trip. The understated inventory was cover for the skimming. The scouting trips were reconnaissance for the next leg. And day 30 was 7 days away. I put everything back. I re-zipped the pack, replaced it exactly, and went back to bed. I did not sleep. I lay in the dark and listened to the house breathe. Della's soft snoring, Orrin's restless shifting, Calder's silence. And I calculated. If Galt left on day 30, he would take food, ammunition, and whatever else he'd cached. That loss was manageable. If he left alone, the group would be smaller but more cohesive. The problem was the map. It showed my property, which meant whoever was at CP knew this location existed. Galt was a scout, and scouts report back. The next morning, I pulled Bryn aside and showed her what I'd found. I'd redrawn the map from memory, marking the key points. Bryn studied it with the focused silence of someone who understands terrain. "Collection point," she said. "Military?" "Maybe. Or organized survivors. Either way, he's reporting to someone." "You think they'd come here?" "I think Galt's been cataloging everything. Our supplies, our defenses, our numbers, our weapons. If whoever he's reporting to wants what we have, they have the blueprint." Bryn looked at me. "So we have 2 problems, him leaving and what happens after he leaves." "Yes." "Do we tell the others?" I thought about Orrin, who would want to confront Galt immediately and probably physically. I thought about Della, whose anxiety was already running high. I thought about Calder, 17 years old, who had already seen enough. Not yet. I need to talk to him first. Talk to him? "Harlan. He's been stealing from us and feeding information to an outside group." "I know, but I don't know what that group is. If it's military, that might be good news. If it's not, we need to know what we're dealing with before we act." Bryn didn't agree, but she deferred. I think she understood that in a confined space, information is more valuable than confrontation. A fight gives you clarity for 5 minutes. Intelligence gives you clarity for days. I chose my moment carefully. Day 27, mid-afternoon. Della and Orrin were in the kitchen. Calder was asleep. The boy slept heavily in the afternoons, a habit I recognized from my own youth on the farm, when the body learns to bank rest against unpredictable demand. Bryn was on perimeter watch, outside, walking the tree line with her rifle. I sat down across from Galt in the living room. He was reading one of my old farmer's almanacs, or pretending to. "Tell me about the collection point," I said. To his credit, Galt didn't ask what I was talking about. He didn't feign confusion or denial. He closed the almanac, set it on the arm of the chair, and looked at me with an expression that was, for the first time, unmanaged. Not scared. Recalculating. "You went through my pack." "Yes." "When?" "Does it matter?" Long pause. Then Galt leaned back. "No, I suppose it doesn't." He told me. Not all of it, and not the truth, but a version calibrated to the fact that I already knew more than he wanted me to. He said the collection point was a group of survivors, organized, well-supplied, operating out of a facility west of here. He said he'd been connected to them before the outbreak through what he called preparedness networks. He said they'd established a supply chain across central Iowa, using scouts to identify resource caches and defensible properties. He said my farm had been flagged early because of the propane tank, the well, and the barn, all visible from satellite imagery. "You came here on purpose," I said. "I came here because it was on the route, and because it made sense logistically." "And Bryn? Calder?" Another pause. Longer. "I met them on the road. That part was true. They were useful cover. A man traveling alone attracts suspicion. A man traveling with a woman and a kid looks like a family." I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not surprise. I'd already assembled most of this picture. But hearing him say it, hearing Bryn and Calder reduced to useful cover, confirmed a category of person I'd hoped I was wrong about. Galt wasn't malicious in the dramatic sense. He didn't want to hurt anyone. He simply didn't include anyone in his calculations except as variables. We were inputs, not people. The food he'd taken wasn't stolen in his mind. It was allocated. The information he'd gathered wasn't betrayal. It was reporting. He operated in a moral framework where optimization replaced ethics, and the most efficient outcome was, by definition, the right one. "What happens on day 30?" I asked. "I leave. I report the status of this location. The group sends a team to make contact." "Contact or acquisition?" Galt held my gaze. "That depends on what they find." "What does that mean?" "It means if this place is viable and cooperative, it becomes a node in the network. Supplies flow in and out, mutual defense, coordination. If it's not cooperative," he let the sentence dissolve. "If it's not cooperative, they take it." I didn't say that. You didn't have to. We sat in silence for a full minute. I could hear Della washing dishes in the kitchen. The mundane sound of survival, water, soap, ceramic, continuing without interruption 5 rooms away from a conversation about whether our home would be seized by armed strangers in a week. "I'm going to give you a choice," I said. "Not because you deserve one, but because shooting you creates more problems than it solves. And putting you outside gets you to that collection point faster than day 30. Galt waited. "You leave tomorrow. First light. You take your pack, your pistol, and whatever food was in your bag before you started skimming from mine. Not the cans you stole. I'll be taking those back tonight. You walk west. You report whatever you want. But you tell them this: the property is occupied, armed, and not interested in being a node. If they come here, they'll find the driveway mined." "Is it mined?" You don't know, and neither will they. And if I tell them it's an easy target? Then they come, and some of them die, and you'll have sent them into something you could have warned them about. That's between you and whoever you pray to. Galt studied me for a long moment. I could see him running the math, the real math, not the kind he put on legal pads. Could he take me? No. I was bigger. I was armed, and Bryn was 100 yards away with a rifle and instructions. Could he talk his way back in? No. The others would know within the hour. Could he bargain? Let me take Calder, he said. The cold in my chest became ice. No. The group has resources, medical, food, security. The boy would be safer there than here. The boy stays. You can't keep him. He's not yours. He's not yours either. He's Bryn's. Bryn's his aunt by marriage. She has no legal. I almost laughed. There is no legal, Galt. There's just us, in this house, deciding what we'll tolerate. And I will not tolerate you taking a 17-year-old boy to a group of armed strangers who send scouts to inventory farmhouses. That's my final answer. He left the next morning. True to the agreement, I returned 4 cans to the supply from his pack, keeping count in front of Bryn as witness. Galt took what was his, shouldered his pack, and walked down the driveway at 6:15 a.m. He didn't say goodbye to Della or Orrin. He paused near Calder, who was sitting on the porch step, and said something I couldn't hear. Calder didn't respond. Galt walked. I watched him through the binoculars until he reached the county road, turned west, and disappeared into the landscape. Then I went inside and told the rest of the group everything. Orrin's reaction was what I expected. Fury, followed by self-recrimination for not seeing it, followed by a practical pivot to the problem at hand. So they might come for us. They might. When? Day 30 at the earliest. 5 days. But Galt was their eyes. Without his report, they might wait. Or they might come sooner because they lost contact. Della was quiet. She's a quiet woman generally, but this was a different quiet. Not passive, but processing. Finally, she said, "Can we defend this place?" Against infected, yes. Against organized people with weapons, not for long. Then what are our options? We spent the rest of that day planning, not for defense, for departure. I know how that sounds. I'd spent 27 years on that property. I'd been born in the upstairs bedroom. My father died in the room that was now Della's. Every object, every post, every furrow in that land carried the accumulated weight of my life's labor. Leaving was not a decision about logistics. It was an amputation. But I'd learned something from the pigs, from the starlings, from every animal instinct I'd observed over a lifetime. When the environment changes beyond your capacity to adapt, you move. You don't stay because the place is yours. You stay because the place is viable. And a farmhouse that might have armed strangers arriving in 5 days was no longer viable. Bryn and I scouted south that afternoon. The Tremmel property, a mile down the road, was abandoned and partially burned. Beyond it, following a gravel section road, was a property I knew only by reputation. The old Wallert Dairy, a 160-acre spread with a 2-story stone house built in the 1880s. Stone, not wood frame, not vinyl siding. Limestone block, 18 inches thick, with a spring-fed water system and a root cellar that, according to local history, had once served as a stop on the Underground Railroad. It was empty. The Wallerts had moved to Arizona in 2018. The property had been leased for hay production, but nobody was producing hay anymore. The house was locked but not secured. We gained entry through a basement window. Inside, it was dusty, cold, and intact. The spring still ran. The cellar was dry. The walls were stone and the windows were small and high, designed for an era when windows were vulnerabilities, not amenities. We moved the next day, all 5 of us, on foot, carrying what we could. I took the rifle, ammunition, the medical supplies, the remaining canned goods in 2 packs, and my father's binoculars. Orrin carried his shotgun and the shells from his own house. Della walked slowly but without complaint, leaning on Calder when the road was rough. Bryn took point. I locked the farmhouse behind me. Both doors, crossbars in place, plywood sealed. I don't know why. Nobody was coming home. But the act of locking a door is a promise to the structure that it still matters. And I owed the house at least that much of a lie. We reached the Wallert place in 2 hours. No contact, no incident. The road was empty. The fields were empty. Iowa in early October, under a sky so blue it looked synthetic, with standing corn going to waste in every direction and not a single machine running to bring it in. The silence had become the landscape's dominant feature, more present than the hills or the tree lines. You moved through it the way you'd move through fog, aware that it was a medium, not an absence. The Wallert house was everything my house wasn't. The stone walls deadened sound and held temperature. The windows, being small and high, were easy to secure. Orrin had them boarded within a day using lumber from an outbuilding. The spring provided water without electricity. The root cellar, dug into the hillside behind the house, was a natural cold storage unit, 45 degrees year-round. We stocked it with our supplies and felt, for the first time, something adjacent to safety. But safety is a condition, not a state. It requires maintenance. On what would have been day 30 at my farmhouse, I returned alone. I walked the 1.5 miles at first light, rifle slung, moving through the ditch line rather than the road. I wanted to see if anyone had come. They had. 2 vehicles were parked in my yard, a black SUV and a flatbed truck. The SUV had no plates. The flatbed had Iowa commercial tags and was loaded with supplies, fuel cans, water jugs, and what looked like building materials. 3 men were visible outside the house. They were trying to get in through the front door, which was holding because of the crossbar. One of them had a pry bar. Another was walking the perimeter, testing windows. I lay in the ditch, 400 yards away, and watched through the binoculars. Galt was not among them. I don't know if that meant anything. The 3 men I could see were practical, organized, and equipped. Not a raiding party, exactly, but not a welcome wagon either. They had the body language of people executing a task, not exploring. They knew the house. They knew what was inside. Galt had reported. After an hour, the man with the pry bar gave up on the door and moved to the south window, the one Bryn had reinforced with angled brackets. He worked at it for 20 minutes and couldn't get the plywood off. I watched him step back, look at the window, and then look at the man beside him. The second man shook his head. They conferred. Then all 3 got back in their vehicles and drove west, back toward wherever they'd come from. They hadn't gotten in. The house held, not because it was impregnable, but because the reinforcements added enough difficulty that the cost exceeded the expected value. Galt had told them what was inside. 20-some cans, a generator, a well. And the men had calculated that breaching secured plywood for those returns wasn't worth the time. If we'd been inside, if they'd seen lights or movement, the calculation might have been different. A house with people in it implies more resources than a house without. But we were gone, and the house was just a locked box. And locked boxes that don't open easily get left for later. I walked back to the Wallert place, feeling something I hadn't expected. Gratitude toward Galt. Not for what he'd done. That was betrayal, clean and simple. But for the timing. He'd shown me what was coming while there was still time to move. If he'd been more patient, if he'd waited until day 30 and disappeared in the night, those 3 men would have arrived at an occupied farmhouse with 5 people asleep inside. His impatience, the premature skimming, the overly familiar navigation of Orrin's house, the backpack that was always packed, had been the tells that saved us. He was a competent operator, undone by a con artist's oldest flaw. He couldn't stop running the game even when holding still would have served him better. The weeks that followed at the Wallert place were not dramatic. I want to say that because drama is what people expect from survival stories, and I've learned that expectation distorts the truth. Most of survival is not crisis. It is tedium, maintenance, and the slow psychological work of living with people you didn't choose in circumstances you can't control. Bryn and I developed a scouting pattern. Alternating day circuits of the surrounding mile, checking roads, noting movement, marking properties we might scavenge. We found useful things. A propane tank at the Tremel ruin that was still half full. A hand pump in a neighbor's garage. A root cellar at an abandoned property that held 30 jars of home-canned tomatoes and green beans from the prior summer. We carried everything back and cataloged it honestly, without Galt's creative accounting. Della stabilized. Her blood sugar management was imperfect. We had a limited supply of her medication, and I knew it would run out eventually. But the reduced stress of thick walls, reliable water, and a competent group gave her system room to regulate. She found purpose in organizing the root cellar, maintaining a meticulous inventory on paper, and teaching Calder basic nutrition from memory. She was a better leader than anyone acknowledged, because her leadership didn't look like command. It looked like order. And order is invisible until it's absent. Orrin and I rebuilt our working partnership, but it was different now. The Galt episode had introduced a variable that hadn't existed between us before. The awareness that people inside your perimeter could be more dangerous than the things outside it. We didn't talk about it directly. We just started locking the interior doors at night, something we hadn't done at my house. Old trust had a crack in it, and while the crack wasn't between us, it was in the room. Calder grew up. I don't mean that metaphorically. In the span of about 3 weeks, the boy underwent the kind of accelerated maturation that removes the word boy from the description. He learned to shoot. Bryn taught him, patiently, on the back acreage using the .22 rifle we'd scavenged. He learned to read terrain, which approaches were visible, which blind, where a person could move unseen. He asked me to teach him generator maintenance, and I did, and he learned it with the quiet competence of someone who understands that knowledge is currency in a world without banks. One evening, he asked me what I thought Galt had whispered to him on the porch. "I don't know," I said. "What did he say?" He said, "This place won't last. When you're ready to leave, go west." Do you believe him? Calder considered this with a seriousness that made him look older than 17. I believe he believes it. But I think he says whatever gets people moving in the direction he wants them to go. That was, I think, the most accurate assessment of Galt fording anyone ever produced. On day 45, the radio out of Omaha changed. Dale's tired voice was replaced by an official broadcast. Military. Clipped, structured. The 185th Air Refueling Wing out of Sioux City had established a secure zone in northwest Iowa. They were accepting civilians. They broadcast coordinates and a frequency for approach communication. The message repeated every 10 minutes, interspersed with situation reports. The Mississippi line was holding in some sectors, collapsing in others. Des Moines was abandoned. Omaha was partially secure. The infection had plateaued in density, but not in geographic spread. There was no cure, no vaccine, no timeline. We listened to that broadcast for 3 days before discussing it. I think we all needed time to sit with the possibility of something beyond our own walls before we could evaluate it rationally. Hope is disorienting when you've been running on calculation. Bryn was forgoing. She'd been a pragmatist since the day she arrived, and her pragmatism said that 5 people in a stone house with dwindling canned goods and 1 diabetic member who was slowly running out of medication could not sustain indefinitely. The military zone was 180 miles northwest. Hard travel, but possible. Orrin was against it. He'd already lost 1 home. He didn't want to lose another, even one that wasn't his. The Wallert place was working. Why risk a 10-day walk through open country for a radio promise? Della surprised me. She said, "My medication will run out in 3 weeks. After that, I have maybe a month before I'm a liability. If there's a medical facility in Sioux City, I need to try." There was nothing to say to that. Della had done the math on her own body, the way I'd done the math on the propane, and the number she'd arrived at was a deadline. Calder said, "I'll go where Bryn goes." They all looked at me. Here is what I want to say about that moment, because it is the moment the story turns, and not in the way anyone expects. I was not the leader. I had never been the leader. I was the man who owned the first house, and then the man who knew the area, and then the man who made decisions that happened to be right. But all of that was circumstance, not character. The real leaders were Della, who kept order, Bryn, who kept watch, Orrin, who kept things built, and Calder, who kept learning. I was the narrator. That's a different thing. And the narrator, in this story, had a daughter in Minneapolis who he hadn't heard from in 45 days. Minneapolis was northeast. Sioux City was northwest. They were not the same direction. I told them. I said that I wanted them to go to Sioux City, all 4 of them together. That Bryn could lead the group. That Orrin knew how to build shelter, and Della knew how to manage supplies, and Calder could shoot and scout and carry weight. That they didn't need me, and that I was going to Minneapolis. The silence that followed was the loudest sound I'd heard since the outbreak began. Bryn spoke first. "That's suicide." "Maybe." "You don't know if she's alive." "No." "You don't know if Minneapolis is accessible." "No." "You have no route intelligence, no resupply, and no partner." "I know." "Then why?" "Because she's my daughter. And because if I go to Sioux City and sit behind a military fence and eat 3 meals a day while she's—" I stopped. The sentence didn't need finishing. Orrin said, "Harlan. Just my name. The way you'd say the name of someone doing something you understand completely and cannot endorse." We spent 2 more days at the Wallert place. I helped Bryn plan the Sioux City route, back roads, water sources, defensible rest points. I gave Orrin the Remington because Bryn already had a rifle, and a 4-person group needs 2 long guns. I kept the .22 and Galt's pistol, which I'd confiscated from his bag before I'd recounted the cans. I haven't mentioned that, but it was among the adjustments I made that night. Galt had walked out with an empty holster. He probably realized it a mile down the road. I hope it bothered him. On the morning we separated, Della handed me a bag of supplies she'd portioned out. Not equal to a 1/5 of our stores, but close. I tried to refuse. She said, "Harlan Selvedge, I have been rationing food for 6 people for a month. Don't you dare tell me I don't know how to divide it." I hugged her. I'm not a man who hugs easily or often. But Della Stagg had earned it, and the world was short on earned things. Bryn walked me to the road. She didn't say goodbye. She said, "If Minneapolis doesn't work, the frequency for the Sioux City zone is 7.285 megahertz. Check in at noon. I'll listen for 30 days. And after 30 days, I'll listen for 60. Calder shook my hand. He had a grip like a grown man now. "Thank you for what you taught me," he said. "About the generator and the rest of it. Thank you for telling me about his backpack." Calder nodded. He understood. I walked northeast. They walked northwest. The October sky was cold and high, and the fields stretched in every direction, and the road was a line drawn through a silence that had once been a country. I didn't look back. Not because I wasn't tempted, but because I knew that if I turned around, I'd see 4 people getting smaller against the horizon, and that image would make me want to follow them. And following them would mean giving up on Lenore. So I walked. One direction. Forward. The first 3 days were uneventful in the way that survival is uneventful when you're alone. Every hour is the same hour, repeated, with minor variations in terrain and weather. I moved during daylight, averaging about 15 miles a day on back roads. I avoided anything that looked like a town. I slept in ditches, in a machine shed, in the cab of an abandoned grain truck that still smelled like corn dust and diesel. I ate sparingly. I rationed water. I saw infected, singles, pairs, once a group of 5 on a highway overpass, silhouetted against the sunset like figures in a painting nobody would want to hang. They didn't see me, or didn't care. I was learning what other survivors had apparently learned. If you're quiet, slow, and low to the ground, you're furniture. They orient to sound, to motion, to light. A man walking steadily through a bean field at dusk is almost invisible. On the 4th day, I found the note. It was at a crossroads east of Marshalltown, tacked to a signpost with a nail. A piece of cardboard, written in marker. It said, "Alive, heading north. Left supplies in Red Barn 2 miles east. GF." GF. Galt Fording. I stood at that crossroads for a long time. The note was weathered, maybe a week old, maybe less. 2 miles east, a red barn with supplies. It could be a cache. It could be a trap. It could be Galt's version of generosity, which was indistinguishable from Galt's version of strategy. I went east, not because I trusted Galt, but because hunger makes philosophers into pragmatists. The red barn was real, a large livestock barn, open on one end, empty of animals. Inside, on a hay bale near the door, was a cardboard box containing 4 cans of food, a bottle of water, a packet of ibuprofen, and another note. "Harlan, I figure you'll go after your daughter. This is on the route." The group at the CP turned out to be less organized than advertised. I left. If you make it to Minneapolis, there's a community at the Midtown Greenway. West entrance. Tell them Dale from Omaha sent you. They won't shoot. G. I read it 3 times. Then I ate one of the cans. Peaches in heavy syrup, the most calories per ounce item in the box. And sat with the contradiction of Galt Fording, a man who had stolen from me, lied to me, used a woman and a teenager as camouflage, and inventoried my home for potential seizure, now leaving supplies on my projected route with accurate navigational intelligence. Was it guilt? I don't think Galt experienced guilt in any conventional sense. Was it strategy? Possibly. A man who helps you once creates a debt, and debts are leverage. Was it some irreducible human thing that persists even in people who've optimized most of their humanity away? Maybe. I don't know. I've spent a long time thinking about Galt, and the conclusion I've reached is that he was not a villain or a con artist or a sociopath. He was a man who understood systems better than people, who treated relationships as logistics problems, and who was capable of genuine helpfulness when it aligned with his trajectory. The supplies in the barn didn't cost him much. The information about the Midtown Greenway might save my life. And if I survived because of his intelligence, he'd have an ally in Minneapolis, which was a node worth cultivating. Even his kindness was strategic. But it was still kindness. And in a world where the dead walked the roads and the living hid in stone houses, I was not in a position to refuse any kindness, regardless of its source. I took the supplies and continued northeast. It took me 11 more days to reach the southern edge of the Twin Cities metro. I won't recount every mile. This is not a travel story. But I will say that by the time I saw the skyline of Minneapolis, gray and silent under a November sky, I had been alone for 15 days, and the solitude had done something to my inner architecture. Not broken it, renovated it. I'd spent my whole life in relationship to things. The farm, the pigs, the equipment, the land, the house. Objects that needed me. Without them, I was just a body moving through space, and the discovery that this was sufficient, that I could persist without being needed, was both liberating and terrifying. The Midtown Greenway was a converted rail corridor running east-west through South Minneapolis. I found the west entrance on day 60, in late November, with frost on the ground and my last can of food 3 days behind me. There were barricades, vehicles, shipping containers, stacked lumber, and behind them, people. Living people, organized, with fires burning and structures erected along the old rail bed. A sentry challenged me from behind a barricade. I said what Galt's note told me to say. Dale from Omaha sent me. The sentry paused, conferred with someone I couldn't see, and opened a gap in the barricade. "Who are you?" he asked. "Harlan Selvedge. I'm looking for my daughter, Lenore Selvedge." "Don't know the name, but we've got about 400 people in here. You can look." I walked into the Greenway community and spent 3 hours searching faces, asking questions, describing Lenore. 28, dark hair, my eyes, a civil engineer who worked for a firm downtown. Nobody recognized the name. Nobody had seen her. I sat on a bench near one of the fire barrels as the afternoon turned to evening, and I let the possibility that I'd walked 300 miles for nothing settle into my body. It was heavy. Not crushing. I'd expected this outcome as one of the possibilities. But heavy. Then a woman approached me. She was young, maybe 30, carrying a clipboard. The Greenway community had administrators, a fact that both impressed and amused me. She asked if I was the one looking for Lenore Selvedge. Yes. There was a Lenore here, early on, in the first 2 weeks. She helped with the water filtration setup. Engineer? Yes, that's her. She left, about a month ago. Went north with a group heading to Duluth. There's a naval facility there taking in civilians. Duluth. Yeah. She talked about her dad a lot. Said he was a farmer somewhere in Iowa and she was worried about him. I sat with that. My daughter, alive a month ago, moving north, worried about me while I worried about her. 2 people in a broken country, orbiting each other at a distance too large to close, each assuming the other was the one in danger. I stayed at the Greenway for 4 days. I rested, ate, helped repair a section of perimeter wall, and gathered intelligence about the Duluth route. On the 5th day I left, walking north, carrying a pack they'd given me with 3 days of food. I could tell you the rest, the walk north, the weather, the encounters, but the story that matters is already complete. Not because I found Lenore at the end of the road. I didn't. Not yet. The walk to Duluth took another 2 weeks, through worsening cold, through terrain I didn't know, through encounters with infected and survivors that tested everything I'd learned. When I reached the naval facility at the port, I gave my name and asked for hers. They checked a handwritten registry. She was there. Harlan Selvedge, registered, alive, quartered in Building 7. A sailor walked me across the compound. I won't describe what I felt during that walk, because language does not have the resolution for it. I'll tell you only that the building was a converted warehouse, that the door was heavy, that the light inside was warm, and that my daughter was sitting at a table playing cards with 3 strangers, and that when she looked up and saw me, she made a sound that I will hear for the rest of my life. I will hear it longer than the silence, longer than the wind in the corn, longer than every calculation, every count, every estimate, every pragmatic decision I made in the weeks before. That sound, my daughter's voice, breaking open, is the thing I was walking toward without knowing its shape. And it is the only number in any inventory that ever actually mattered. I think about the farm sometimes. The house with its plywood windows and crossbar doors, still locked, still standing for all I know. The Wallert place where Della kept inventory on a legal pad and Orrin built things that held. I think about Bryn and Calder, and whether they reached Sioux City, and whether Bryn still listens on 7.285 at noon. I think about Galt Fording, out there somewhere, optimizing, calculating, leaving cans of food on projected routes for people he used and couldn't quite stop helping. I think about the pigs. 12 sows, released into the creek bottom, surviving on instinct in a world that no longer had fences. They're probably feral by now, if they're alive. Rooting through the timber, raising litters in the underbrush, becoming something older than the operation I'd built around them. The thought doesn't make me sad. It makes me think that the purpose of a structure, a farm, a house, a system, a life, is not to persist. It is to hold things until they're ready to be released. I was a farmer. Then I was a man in a locked house. Then I was a man who left. The leaving was the hardest part, and the most necessary. And if you're reading this, or hearing this, from inside your own locked house, wondering whether the supplies will last, whether the walls will hold, whether the people around you can be trusted, I'll tell you the one thing I learned that no inventory or fortification taught me. The house doesn't save you. The leaving saves you. But only if you know where you're walking, and only if the person at the other end is worth the road. Lenore was worth the road. She is sitting across from me right now, in a room in Duluth with frost on the windows and a Navy-issue blanket around her shoulders. And she is alive. And I am alive. And the road between us is closed. That's enough. In a world like this, that is enough.